my goal was to not be cynical as I was writing this. Like I said, I didn't want to make fun of anyone really,
Yeah.
because these people, whoever they are, fundamentalists, whatever, they're holding to these beliefs in
Yeah.
a legitimate way.
Yeah.
And I think the problem is, ultimately, I think the God they say they worship is really a monster.
Yeah.
And they're afraid of God. And they think they have like this little sliver of Christianity. This is the truth. And
Yeah.
if you veer from this, you are lost forever.
Yeah.
Uh, and so it just sort of it makes me sad in a lot of ways. Of like the human experience is so much bigger than this.
Yeah.
See?
I think I recognize the background from a YouTube
Oh, that's
interview
very
you did
possible.
with two women,
Yes.
nice women, talking
Anyway,
about your novel maybe a year ago.
yes. Yeah, there's a
And as part
program.
of my homework on you, besides reading your book and very much enjoying it, and we will talk about that, um, I, I, looked at the interwebs to see what I could find on you. You
Mhm.
don't have a huge footprint on YouTube or places, which is
Right.
probably smart. But I enjoyed that interview and I learned some things about you and so forth. But we'll get going here in a minute. Paul Russo recommended you,
Yes. Yeah.
and we had such a good time interviewing Paul. And actually, his book is about to be our book club selection for, I think, this month. It's our December book.
Fantastic.
So, Friendly Fire, and you are the wonderful editor he talks
Mhm.
about in the book. So, I didn't put all that together until my producer Ernie reminded me how we got hold of you. So, the first thing I want to do is just thank you for um, stepping out and picking up Friendly Fire and going to bat for it. I mean, you did what great editors do. You found a guy, and I'm very intrigued to see what Paul will write next.
Mhm.
I hope he's working on something. I encouraged him.
Mhm.
I told him, "You're a really good writer. I hope you're
Fantastic
doing
writer.
more stuff."
Yeah. Yeah, that was one where the proposal, or the proposal, the full manuscript came into my inbox, and I started reading it, and I was like, by the end of the first chapter, I didn't know anything
Yeah.
about who this person was. By the end of the first chapter, he was accidentally shot in the head by his best friend and roommate. I was like, what is this
Yeah.
book about? And so I read the whole thing over a weekend, which I never do. So
Yeah.
it's
Well,
fantastic.
you were well met because it's a great book and really, terrific. Actually, sort of in an odd way, fits in with yours in a sense that, guns
Mhm.
loose out there somewhere, shots miscellaneously fired through walls.
I can see
Hey,
that.
let me introduce you properly and we'll get going here. My name is Frank Schaeffer, and this is In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer. It's my podcast, and my guest today is Austin Ross. And Austin is a novelist and screenwriter and an essayist, and is a senior editor with HarperCollins. His fiction essays have been featured in Publishers Weekly, Literary Hub, and elsewhere. He co wrote the adaptation of his story, The Man for the Job, the short film version of which is in post production. We today are talking about a book that I just finished reading this morning. He's the author of a novel, Gloria Patri. And Austin is referred to us by Paul Russo, who my listeners will remember as the author of Friendly Fire. He was the guy that got shot in his head randomly through a wall by a roommate who is messing with guns in a college. And the story unfolded. And it's one of the podcasts I remember best because the book made such a big impression upon me. And Austin, amongst other things of writing a terrific novel, Gloria Patri, that we're going to talk about today, found the novel about Paul getting shot in the head in his inbox and read the whole thing, and then is referred to in the novel. I mean, not the novel in the book as the person who sort of went to bat for it and got it published. And I was so pleased that you're my guest today because I wanted to thank you for editing that book and giving it wings. Made such a big impression on me. Please subscribe right now on YouTube. This is a YouTube live, and we'll stay on YouTube as a podcast. And to my commentary page, In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer on Apple Podcasts. And my Substack, it has to be said at frankschaeffer.substack.com. And we're going to be doing Paul's book, Friendly Fire, as I think our next book club offering. And I wanted to ask you, Austin, if we could do your novel, Gloria Patri, as a book club offering. I think it would be in April. Um, I I think that from what I could tell, besides Kindle, on Amazon, I went to your publisher site, and I don't know, is it in paperback now? How will people get that if they want to get the book?
It's available in paperback and in the ebook. So,
Okay, so it's out there. All
mhm.
right, long rambling introduction. Thank you, and I enjoyed your book. And what I've done is I've pulled some quotes from the book that kind of follow a line of thought I want to pursue with you. I
Okay.
always find it difficult to interview people about novels because what are you going to do? Sit and tell the story, and then just talk about the craft of writing. But I have a kind of an interest here that is particular in my own evangelical background.
Mhm.
So I'm going to ask you a weird question, which I would never do normally. But how much do you know about me and what I come from in terms of what the New York Times once referred to as evangelical royalty? Have you got any clue who you're talking to today?
Of course I do. Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah. Your dad is very famous, very
oh,
familiar with him.
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, and I've written things like my memoir, Crazy for God, and other
Sure.
books. In fact, my
Mhm.
first novel, Portofino, is really what exited me from the evangelical world because people thought I was making fun of fundamentalism. And so I got helped along in my own flight back in the 1990s when it was published. And the reason I start that way is because the quotes I picked from your book kind of follow a line of another author, Jeff Charlotte, who we interviewed a while back again for his book on militias.
Mhm.
And he's someone I've known for years. And his book is called The Undertow: Scenes from a Slow Civil War. And it's not a novel. It's basically a journal he kept traveling around that he published in Rolling Stone and other places, meeting with the kind of militia groups that your novel is sort of about. Okay, so that's one theme I want to talk about. What's happening out there that you've learned about because of the research for your novel. The other thing I want to do is go to some quotes in the book that are not random, although they will seem that way at first, which not so much follow the story, but will help me get an insight to who you are. Because as one insider to another, when I was reading your novel, I was saying, "Oh yeah, well, he knows this world. He's got the terminology down." And so the first thing I want to ask you before we get into the quotes is, what is your background? Mine is a missionary child growing up in Europe. And then I left that evangelical background. But I was taught from my mother's knee, the lingo and the language of evangelicalism, some of which is in your book. So, what is your background personally, irrespective of the book and your writing? How do you know about this as a subject?
Yeah. Well, so growing up, my dad still is a pastor. So grew up very much in the church, would go to church multiple times a week
Yeah,
and sort of theologically and socially as well. Kind of
yeah,
our family grew more and more conservative in lots of different ways, and so kind of became more entrenched in the evangelical fundamentalist realm. Kind of started
yeah.
in more liberal mainline Protestant denomination, and then slowly kind of moved our way into this other realm, and then
And how did
eventually.
that happen? Just talk about that for a minute. Why did you move from more liberal Protestantism into a more conservative? And give me some dates and hooks and
Sure.
geography.
Well, so my it has to do with my dad. So my dad had surgery, and it was the doctors essentially were like, "We have to have the surgery right now, otherwise, like you might die." And in the hospital, my dad was like, "God, if you save me from this, I'll do whatever you want." And from there, he says, he was sort of converted to biblical Christianity, and read through the whole Bible and led this Bible study and started reading people like John Calvin and different, theologians in that realm. And so that was really the catalyst that started.
And where was this happening geographically? Where were you living?
We were in St. Louis, which is where I
And
was
how
born.
old were you?
This happened before, I believe it was before I was born, maybe
Okay.
right after. But yeah, so we only lived in St. Louis for about a year and a half before we moved. And the reason we moved is because some theological shiftings kind of necessitated a church move. So,
And what were those about? Just give me the bottom line on that. What happened?
well, so my dad had started as a pastor in the United Church of Christ. And then I'm trying to think of the timeline exactly of where we were and what denominations we were. So we moved from St. Louis to Evansville, Indiana. We were there for a
Mhm.
couple of years. Was still, I think, yeah, that was still a UCC church. He was still trying to make it work there. But then when that didn't work out, then it was like we have to change to a different denomination, which ended up becoming what's called the Four Cs, Christian Conservative Congregational Conference.
How
And
old were
then
you? How old were you then?
I would have been when we moved to the Four Cs, yeah, that conference, 8 or 9, maybe something
And
like that.
and siblings? How big a tribe is moving?
Yeah, so I have two siblings. I have an older sister and then a twin brother, and so
Okay.
we all moved. Yeah, obviously, I'll move together.
Yeah.
Uh, and so then eventually, from the Four Cs, shifted again when I was a teenager, I guess, into the PCA, Presbyterian Church of America.
Yeah.
But in between, actually, in between the Four Cs and the PCA was a period of about 3 or 4 years where we had a home church with one
Yeah.
other family, which is where a lot of this material was maybe inspired by, let's say.
Yeah. Now, are you going to school? Are you being homeschooled? And if I met you one afternoon when you're age 10 to 13 and said, um, Austin, what do you believe? Would you say, I believe in Jesus Christ as my personal savior? Would you say I'm having doubts and I want to get out of here? Who were you when you were a child and all this ferment of moving and denominational this and that and split is going on around you?
Mm-hmm. So I was homeschooled. I was homeschooled through high school. In high school, I did, I forget what they call it, early enrollment in like a community college.
And where
Uh,
was that?
that was in Marietta, Ohio, a
And who
place
was
called,
doing the homeschooling?
mostly my mom.
Okay, now was she any good at it?
She was pretty good at it. Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, you're an editor, so you learned to read at some point.
That, yeah.
So
And
you're
that,
ahead of me on that. I was 10 when I was learning to read because my homeschooling was an utter failure.
yes, yeah, it's really runs the gamut. But yeah, she did very well at it. It wasn't necessarily the homeschooling. I think was something that my, I think my dad was driving that. Like I
Yeah,
wasn't. If it was up to my mom. I don't think she would have said, "Yeah, we definitely need to do this."
yeah.
Um, so yeah, she did well. But
And where would you place your father's journey on a kind of a spectrum of the march toward the sort of Christian nationalism we're in now? When I talked to my friend Tim Alberta, who wrote a book, I'm just reading the title on the side here, the Kingdom, the Power, and the Glory. Tim and Jeff Charlotte and I were all exchanging stories on just sort of where we were when.
mhm,
And, Tim's dad is a pastor, and he wrote a book declaring himself as an evangelical, but at the same time, very critical of what had happened to the evangelical movement. So he's very much still in it.
mhm.
I don't want to put words in your mouth or read anything into it, but if you updated to your journey at this very moment as we talk, where's your head at in terms of not just your evangelical background, but so how would you define yourself now? I basically say I'm an atheist who prays. In other words, I am an atheist intellectually conflicted. I'm still my mother's son. And so I don't pretend to have a clean anything, paradox and uncertainty. Where are you kind of at? Because that will inform how I talk with you about your novel.
Yeah. Well, so the last several years have been a period of, I would call it deconstruction for my wife and I in some different areas. So at the moment, I would call myself a Christian universalist. That I think that God actually ultimately loves everybody and will ultimately reconcile all
Yeah,
things, but not really in the evangelical sphere, especially just because of all of the baggage that's tied to that.
sure.
The word itself like means good news. Like I could get
Yeah,
behind that, but so much other stuff kind of comes along
has
with.
happened. Yeah. Yeah. So now you mentioned your wife. Is she someone who has been with you for long enough that you've shared part of this intellectual journey, or did you come to each other kind of ready-made a little bit older? Because I got married when I was 17 and Jeannie was 18. We've been together 54 years. Three of my five grandchildren live across the street. We've got our own little compound going here. Um, and I'm at a very different place than the guy she met. But fortunately, we've traveled a path together, so it kind of stayed. But most of my friends did not haven't been together through most of their lifetime. And I'm always interested when it comes to faith journeys or lack of faith journeys, and you're talking to someone married, how that all plays out within that family.
Hmm. So we got married a little bit older than you, but not too much older. We met in college. We met through a Christian campus ministry.
Yeah.
Got married right out of college, and so we will have been married 15 years this coming August.
And where were you guys in school?
We both went to Ohio University in Athens, Ohio.
Okay, and what was, and I'm sorry, what's your wife's name?
Audrey,
Oh, a nice name. What a good old English name. What was Audrey studying?
we were both studying English, both English majors.
Okay, and then did she wind up um, following a similar path to yours in the sense of doing something with the English major, as in you're actually an editor somewhere, so it kind of pans out and you're a writer? She go in a different direction. What's Audrey up to?
She does some writing. She works in like the civic tech space in the user experience side. So she works with like the CDC,
Yeah.
some government, contracts and things like that. So she does some writing, but not a ton. But
So do you both work from home?
we do. Yeah.
Because where's HarperCollins these days? I know it's part of, is it part of Hachette now?
No, it's separate. Hachette and HarperCollins they're two of the big five, they call them.
Because Hachette wound up buying everybody that's ever published me.
Okay.
My first book was published by Macmillan, my first two novels, and then Penguin picked up my next work. And then, let's see, somebody called the Perseus Book Group published a couple of my nonfiction books, and they got bought by Hachette. And I can't even keep track anymore.
Mhm.
Uh, and I had a few good editors along the road, and then they all sort of got shuffled around. And, well, I don't need to explain what publishing is like to you these days, but it's not what it was when my first novel was published in 1990, put it this way,
Right.
where you had agents and publishers and book tours and readings and regular stuff. Now it's just how big is your online footprint, and all this stuff, as you
Mhm.
know.
Yeah.
So anyway, all right, that kind of locates me. So let's dive into the book a little bit here. What I've done is I've picked some things out that are in no particular order of sequence that basically interest me with my background and my interests. And then I'm hoping in and around this, I can get you to tell some of the story of the book. I know that's a little bit of an odd way in, but I think it's a good one. I'm going to read this passage to you. Naomi left that night to sleep at a hotel. She said she couldn't bear to stay here, even though Ruth had kept her room in pristine condition. Ruth had forgotten that the last time her daughter stayed here, Naomi had asked to change the bedding to another color, to shift the bed itself to a different spot in the room. Anything, it seemed to Ruth, to prevent unwanted images of childhood from returning. So the first thing I want to do is ask you to explain what you're talking about there as a way into your story. I think that's on page 26, so it's pretty early in the book. Where are we at, and why? What happened in that childhood? Set the context of the whole story with that childhood. Tell me who these people are.
So the novel is about this isolationist family. They live on a farm.
Yeah,
Father, mother and father, and then a son and a daughter. And the childhood is very much in that fundamentalist vein
yeah,
of, very strict upbringing, strict in terms of like the clothing that they can wear, the things they can read, the things they can watch or do. It's very much a controlling atmosphere.
yeah.
So that's kind of a childhood aspect of
So
it.
what happened? Why does she want to not be reminded of anything in her childhood, including the color of her sheets?
Well, so it has to do with as she's sort of beginning the journey, kind of how the novel starts is her brother, she learns, has opened fire on a municipal building
Yeah,
with an assault rifle and is killed by the FBI and SWAT teams and things like that. And so they found these, kind of manifesto letters on his person and things like that. And so she's sort of grappling with, how has my brother Solomon become this person
yeah,
essentially? And that's sort of wrapped up with her own um, thoughts and dealing with her own past as far as if this turned Solomon into this person, what has it made me essentially?
Yeah, and the thing is, one reason I wanted to start with that quote is a weird, terrible one, and that is, what I was doing is listening to BBC Radio 4 before, and just listening to their discussion of this assassination of an insurance magnate by somebody who's just been arrested, who sort of reminds me a little bit of people out of your story, gunning people down in cold blood, and wrote a manifesto. We don't know what his ideology is, but all I can say is, Austin, you know, if you're going to write more novels, please don't make them so prophetic in terms of the moment we're in, because between, the militias and the open carry people and making a national hero out of someone who went to a demonstration and gunned some people down, and then right now, ripped from the headlines, an assassin who's now become a popular folk hero from the left as well as the right. Um, Trump is in his second presidency, put there by the kind of people you're writing a book about. What the hell? I mean, your novel was written what, 3 years ago?
So I've been working on versions of this for maybe 15 years or
Yeah, I
so.
knew that from the interview
Version.
I watched
Oh,
with you,
that's
but
right. Yeah.
I should actually say, when was it published?
It was published in August of
Oh,
2022.
2023, wasn't it?
Yeah, 2023. Yes. So
Yeah.
not too long ago, but yeah.
Okay. So anyway, all I want to tell you is it's bizarre that you worked for 15 years on a book that actually just happened now in terms of the election of our extremist president, put in office twice now by a core group of people who are the characters in your novel, without whom he wouldn't be president. I mean, I can't not say that.
It's
So
true.
what does that leave you thinking?
So a lot of the kind of prophetic parts came along with this current version of it. So the earlier versions were pretty different. The
Yeah.
earlier versions were really, I was trying to write a very quiet novel about this.
Yeah, I remember you telling the women you were talking to,
Yeah,
you prefer to read quiet books.
yeah,
And
uh,
then you wrote this for various reasons. Well, this is
yeah.
not a quiet book.
It's not. Really the militia aspect kind of came along pretty, only a couple years ago, and that
Yeah.
was really when things like the Proud Boys were just starting to
Yeah.
kind of gain national awareness, essentially. And I was like, this is an interesting angle, and it seems like all of these things are sort of tied together in some interesting ways.
Well,
So,
just to jump ahead a little bit to a completely different place, I want to do the same thing again, because by reading what I'm going to read from your book here, it gives us a window into, our moment of history right now, as well as your book. And we can go in two directions. We can talk about how this figures in the story. Again, this comes from later in the book. Big Boy leaned in conspiratorially. Do what you've got to do when you get back, especially with the election looking the way it is, with this Negro running for the White House. He's Muslim. We're out here fighting these motherfuckers, and America goes and gets themselves their own goddamn version. Get cash, shortbread, much as you can. Don't put it in the banks. Hide it in your mattress. Bury it in the woods. Do whatever you have to do, but get cash and keep it safe. You think something's going to happen? Something's been happening my whole life, Big Boy said. It's just now that people are starting to notice. So again, ripped from the headlines, because you're basically writing a novel with the kind of characters that Jeff Charlotte wrote a nonfiction book about as he toured the country. That passage that you wrote, because I read Jeff's book as well and interviewed him at length, could have been ripped from the undertow. It wasn't. But so I'm going to ask two questions. First of all, how does that play at this moment? Tell me how that figures in your story. I know because I read it, but I want you to explain to our viewers and listeners. And lastly, let's go back again just to the politics of this moment, because your book is more relevant, several years on from when you published it than it was when it was published. I mean, this is like right now again. These are the people we're talking about. So first of all, tell us a little bit about Big Boy, and I know that's from later in the book, but let's again dive into what your story is about.
yeah, so Andrew is a childhood friend of the isolationist family, and he ends
Yeah,
up enlisting in the military. And while he's overseas in the military, he meets this guy whose nickname is Big Boy.
yeah,
And Big Boy is this sort of crazy, paranoid um, person who they end up, staying in touch when they come back to the States. And Big Boy eventually starts this militia that he
Hmm.
draws Andrew into kind of the orbit of
Well,
that
in the
militia.
next iteration, you can make him the new Secretary of Defense.
There you go. Yeah.
Keep going. I didn't mean to interrupt you.
Oh, I think that was basically it. Just setting up the story of like who Big Boy is. He's
Yeah,
this ex-military guy that Andrew knows he's paranoid, very anti-government, sort of
yeah.
the typical person you might expect in that position.
Now, I want to go back to what we were talking about your own family. Um, how far in this direction, not, I'm not saying like Big Boy, but how
Mhm.
far in the direction of the kind of militant hostility to the first black president or to whatever it might be, did your own family go in terms of your dad or people you were closely associated with? How much of that type of character is actually torn from your own experience of the kind of Americans we're talking that way?
Mhm. So not militant at all.
Right.
Definitely opposed. And I think that was one of the
Guns
things.
in your house?
No, never a gun.
Okay.
Yeah.
Interesting. No, I
Uh,
don't mean you personally right now. I see a guitar back there, not a
yes.
gun.
Yeah. No, even from childhood, my parents.
Okay, interesting. So
My parents
it wasn't that rude for you.
no, all the malicious stuff is really fictionalized.
Yeah,
But I think one of the things that interested me. So a friend of mine from college, he's a journalist named Wesley Lowery. He wrote a couple books. He's a journalist, was with the Washington Post for a while.
yeah,
He wrote a book called American White Lash, where he sort of delves in. And I read this book after I'd already written this novel, but it
yeah,
sort of in some ways centers around this watershed moment in American history, which is the election of Barack Obama,
right.
uh, because so much of what is happening now is a direct result of this.
Yeah,
The
exactly.
reaction against the election of Barack Obama has
Yeah,
caused so much of this that we're experiencing today
yeah.
that I thought was just an interesting avenue to kind of explore.
Well, that's why that particular passage just leapt off the page to me, and I said it's more relevant now than ever because this
Mhm.
is not past history. This is right now. This is what
Yeah.
we're dealing with. Here's another passage that's right now. And I'm just smiling because, it's just so odd to read a novel that sounds like it's been, it's headlines from the story. And I have a little note to myself here. Ask him what's going on here. Okay, I'm going to ask you. Repeat after me. Andrew Wallace Cook, Andrew Wallace Cook, hereby pledge my allegiance to the cause of the citizens of radical empowerment and his house and this house, seeing it fit and just to stop with whatever means necessary the dangerous and un-American overreach of our own federal government and install in its place a constitutionally approved alternative as it is our God-given right as sovereign citizens. May the Lord help me in doing so. Again, not fiction. You've described dozens and dozens of groups here. So I guess my road into this is first tell me where this is in the story, and then tell me again, I guess research is the wrong word, but your own experience or reading that gave you the language, since this wasn't your own home, to
Mhm.
dive so deeply into this mindset.
So I'm trying to remember exactly where this is. I believe he's taking an oath, basically for Big Boy and
Yeah,
the
yeah.
militia. So yeah, so kind of as a
Well, it's
lawyer,
it's late in the book. It's page
right?
222, 223.
223. Okay.
Well,
Um,
that's the Kindle version. I don't know
I guess
which.
that's true. Yeah,
Yeah.
but he's taking an oath, essentially a loyalty oath to
Hmm.
Big Boy and this common cause of the militia and anti-government stuff.
Yeah.
Um, and so yeah, so that all of that is really sort of this, I don't know, amalgamation of a whole bunch of different things that I was reading at the time. So one,
Hmm.
I was reading a lot about the Oregon standoff with Ammon Bundy, which I always thought like, oh, it's kind of funny that am I really going to name, Big Boy's real name is Amos Brainerd, like
Yeah.
the name this guy essentially after Ammon Bundy,
Yeah.
Um, so I was reading a lot about the Oregon standoff, which I just thought was fascinating in a lot of different ways. I was reading a lot about this movement called sovereign citizens, which
Yeah.
essentially they believe that, they're not it's really complicated and hard to
Well, and
explain.
Jeff Sholek gets into a little bit of the
Yeah.
similar thing
Okay.
in his book.
But essentially, they're not under they think they're
No.
not under the authority of the
And they've
government.
been trying this all the way since the religious right emerged, because I remember meeting some of their first guys who would tell me that if I really understood the Constitution, I didn't have to pay taxes.
Ah, yes, that is a big,
That's where it started. It was a tax avoidance thing.
yeah, that's a big part of it.
Yeah.
So it's really a combination of all of these different things. I was reading a
Okay,
lot
so
about.
he's taking an oath, and then what happens because he takes this oath? How does this all play out in the book?
So he takes an oath of loyalty and then ultimately, essentially betrays the oath later on, or at least Big Boy thinks that he does, and it kind of ends in this
Hmm.
violent battle essentially with the FBI.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, sort of Ruby Ridge type stuff too.
yes, yeah, that was very
Um,
much I was tracing kind of in my mind,
yeah,
Waco and Ruby Ridge and all of these some legitimate grievances that people
yeah,
have had with the government, but they have sort
yeah.
of ballooned and snowballed into this thing that is now out of control.
Yeah, and of course, I mean, I don't want to predict this in any way, but I think that this assassination of an executive of an
Mhm.
insurance healthcare company, I think you and I will look back on today and our little discussion here. We're going to remember it because it's oddly timed because something new has started, and I predict that there will be more things like this. I
Mhm.
think there are a lot of Americans who are very angry at the gulf between the super wealthy and powerful and the rest of us.
Mhm.
And I think whether it's from the right or left, this is going to start manifesting. And, you have, some of these tycoons who spend 30 or $40 million a year on personal security. Fat lot of good it's going to do them if there's a movement that gradually rises up against our tech bros and all these other people. If I was a billionaire right now, I'd be doing what Carnegie did and start building libraries and giving some of it back rather than trying to make even more money because they have really fallen out of favor. And I don't think the healthcare thing's the only iteration. I don't know what you think about that.
Yeah, it's been fascinating. I think just the last week, I guess it's only been a week since that happened. But I think that it has revealed
Yeah.
a really surprising bipartisan hatred of
Yes,
of
we hate them.
healthcare.
Yeah.
Everybody hates this.
Yeah.
And it's not, and like you said, it's not just this. Like it's going to, it's going to grow. I think from there.
Yeah.
And
Exactly.
I've read a lot of takes about how like a smart political party would sense this and sort of
Yeah.
jump on an opportunity to build a coalition.
Yeah.
But I think to most both political parties, like the CEO is their colleague essentially. So
Well,
not
look how Elon Musk got folded into the Republican Party.
right.
He's hated, and he's not just hated by people on the left. He's hated because he's got hundreds of billions of dollars, and you and me don't.
Yeah.
And so's Jeff Bezos. So are all these people.
Mhm.
So, dig your bunker in Hawaii, hire your security army, maybe one of your own security guards, like in the French Revolution happened with the Praetorian Guard of the king, turns against you and is going to be the one to take you down. But I would be giving my money away and try to find a way to be generous and change my image if I was any of these people. Just
Yeah.
saying so. Okay, that's a grim thought on the way through. But hey, you've written a grim book,
There we go.
a
Yeah.
good book, a good book, but it opens dark thoughts. Here we go. There was an election that year, 1898. It took a concerted effort to prevent the black man from voting against his own interests, but we made that effort. With guns and with violence, we protected the polls from ignorance, burned down the city's black newspaper building. It was another 90 years before North Carolina sent another one to Congress. And of course, this is again spinning off from the Obama election and just this whole thought of black leadership. So go there a little bit. Let unfold that a little more in your novel. Again, you speak with a prophetic voice within your novel. This is all ripped from the headlines. What incident are you talking about in the 19th century that you refer to there?
So
What was that?
I believe that particular incident was the Tulsa Race Massacre, where
Yeah,
they had Black Wall Street, and there was a sizable, growing black population of people with in sort of increasing societal power, governmental power. They elected for the first
yeah,
time black officials for the government,
yeah,
and then this race massacre happened where they burned down all of Black Wall Street and
sure.
murdered people, and so in the novel it's sort of the idea of like this is going to Big Boy is the one who's talking in the scene.
Yeah.
It's like this is going to continue to cycle because we're going to
We're going to
continue.
keep doing stuff like this. Yeah, and interestingly enough, you can update that story to the very recent present. People still looking for reparations and some sort of justice out of that particular incident, as I understand it. Um, Let me just reintroduce you. This is In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer. My guest is Austin Ross, and we are talking about his book, Gloria Patri, which is a novel, but it's bizarre because if you read it in today's context, it's like it was literally written yesterday about right now, not 3 years ago. And I may say deals with the issues and brings the issues to mind that if I was running a book club, which I sort of do with It Has to Be Read, we're making this an April book. But with students in high school or college or anyone else, if you wanted to read a really well, beautifully crafted piece of fiction, so I'm sorry to be talking about the politics and the religion because it's doing a disservice to your book. Let's just say it's a really, really, really beautiful novel. It's really good. The problem is it's so topical that anybody who reads it is immediately going to go to what's behind the story. That can't be helped. So that's what we're doing today because that's where it's at. So let me get to the next quote in the book, which again I think gets us into the topic that I went to first in interviewing you a moment ago, saying, "Do you have any idea who I am?" And I didn't mean that in the sense of "Do you know who I am?" I
Right.
didn't. Haven't you ever heard of me? I just meant to share our evangelical background at the beginning as a kind of a baseline. So here's a piece of your book that very much speaks to that, and if I was writing your novel, I could have written this passage in the sense that it draws from a background we both have
Mhm.
church splits, moving around, fathers who were pastors, et cetera, et cetera. And I'm going to ask you to explain this in a minute. The video series ended, oddly enough, with a gospel presentation that showed how to invite Christ into one's life. Naomi, despite the grip of fear throughout the series, was comforted by this call of Jesus at the end. She felt as though she were drinking from a fire hydrant with the level of clarity and detail Dr. Holland presented, though she would learn many years later that he had no doctorate and would one day spend 6 years in prison for mail fraud. I love that part. Daddy made the decision that they would leave the homeschool co-op and forge their own education path. By the way, this isn't in the book, but I was on to you from that moment on. Like I had you, I had your number.
I see.
The leader goes to jail for mail fraud. I know these people. I used to be one of them. Maybe he was selling gold-plated sneakers. Who knows?
Mm.
They would no longer be tied to the whims of another, not the state, not their fellow man. The decision, Daddy explained, was a result of poor doctrine on behalf of the co-op leadership, though the end result made little difference to Naomi, as the schoolwork she was as the schoolwork was largely the same, except they stopped taking the state's standardized test each summer. Instead, Daddy filled out a self-evaluation that the State Board of Education found acceptable, but would result in no formal accreditation for Naomi or Solomon. Daddy explained that no one needed a piece of paper from the state to tell them that they were educated. Naomi, despite her vague ambitions to one day go to college, they were so independent, felt that they were so independent that was embarrassed by her sinful pride. And at this point, I said, I know this guy. We can swap stories over a drink. But it's funny because I have had a number of authors, men and women, who come from evangelical backgrounds, who have written all sorts of incredible books, like Tia Levings, who wrote A Well-Trained Wife about her being abused in her Christian marriage. But there's a thread that runs through all of our stories. I say our stories because you'd find it in my memoir, Crazy for God. You'd find it in my novel, Portofino. This sense of we are apart. We are the other. We don't need the world's accreditation. So, when you look at Donald Trump telling everybody it's all fake news and just believe me, I was raised by my parents to already think that way. This is what they may be saying in biology or in the classroom, but we know better because we've got the Bible. And then you get to accreditation of homeschoolers. And I just thought that passage brilliantly, without saying it, kind of encapsulates the flavor and the smell and the taste of a kind of a worldview that just you capture fabulously in the book. But that particular passage just jumped off the page to me. Talk about your background, talk about what that passage in the book means, talk about who these people are,
Yeah.
whatever you want.
Um, so this is based on some other families that I knew growing up. So we always took the standardized tests in our family. But
Yeah,
there were families that I knew growing up who were very much off the grid, who, they were late teenagers and they didn't have driver's licenses, they didn't have
sure.
high school diplomas, they didn't have anything.
Yeah,
Uh, I was like, how are you going to live in this world? Like
yeah,
your parents have essentially set you up for failure.
yeah.
Um, and so I wanted to get at some of that sense of, for the reader, like not for Naomi, because in the moment she's like, yeah, this is a good thing that my dad is doing this.
Sure. And she's proud
Yeah.
of it. She's so
Yeah.
independent.
But for the reader to be reading this and being like, no, no, this is like you're on the path to
Yeah.
destruction, you know. Um, so I think, yeah, that was the sort of flavor that I wanted to get at. Yeah.
So let me go to you personally again here. How isolated were you? Okay, you didn't have guns in the house, so you weren't that kind of people. But how isolated were you? Because that passage really spoke to me in that it would sort of describe how my parents would have viewed the education of their children. Who needs a piece of paper? In
Mhm.
addition to which, God has a great plan for your life. So who needs any credential? You're
Mhm.
just get with the program. But let me get back to your own life personally and your own memories of homeschooling. And at what point did you sort of wake up and think, okay, like you're saying you were in high school before you were out of homeschool? You went
Yes.
all the way through high school, homeschooled?
It was sort of both at the same time. So I was taking classes at a community college, but they counted for high school and for college.
And how did that fit in with all your moves for the church stuff your dad was doing?
So um, we moved to Marietta, Ohio when
Yeah.
I think I was 8, maybe something
Yeah.
like that. And the church that we were at, um, my dad was fired from for various theological reasons when I was about 12. Um,
Because
and
he
so,
had the
yeah,
wrong views or did something or what?
he essentially, well, there's a whole lot involved in that of like, I don't know. I've wrestled personally with like, my dad was fired from a couple of different churches,
Yeah.
and he sort of always paints himself as like the martyr, and there may be some truth in that, but
Yeah.
there's a common denominator here, and it's you, like,
Yeah.
so there's something going on with the way that you're interacting with these people.
Yeah.
So I think that it was sort of a combination of theological shifts on his part, and then
Yeah.
also interpersonal conflict. But I don't
Yeah.
I don't really know because I was so young at the time. I was like,
Maybe
oh,
maybe thinking he was right a lot of the time,
probably, yeah,
as one does in the evangelical milieu.
yes.
Yeah.
Uh, and then I forget what the other part of your
Well, how
question was.
did that affect your own education? Because we're talking about this sense of being isolated and alone, and we don't need pieces of paper. And when I read that, I said, no, no, he lived this
Hmm. So we
somehow.
we weren't super isolated, I would
Yeah.
say. We sort of flirted with it when we had this home church with this one family for a
Yeah.
couple of years. But then, really, because of my mom, we very firmly rejected that. But there were a couple of years where I remember we didn't have a Christmas tree, like we didn't
Sure.
put decorations,
Because you didn't believe that or you didn't have the money.
No, because Christmas is like it has pagan origins.
Yes, it does.
Um, so
They were
yeah,
right about that, but
right.
never
I'm like,
mind.
yeah, just to put up a tree, but so there were a couple of years where we didn't have a Christmas tree up. Halloween, obviously every year we would, turn off all the lights and hide in the basement and watch a movie,
Yeah.
those sorts of
So
things.
nobody would knock on the
Uh,
door, no trick or treating, none of
Nothing
this
like that.
demonic stuff.
Because I have memories earlier in my childhood of like going trick or treating and having, we had a Christmas tree, and then sort of there was this gradual shift into
We were mistaken
fundamental,
then. That's not what we should be doing.
yes, and then the gradual maybe like emergence from that in some
Yeah.
areas, but not in all areas. So yeah.
Well, I swim in this water a lot because even when I'm not interviewing people on my podcast who share that background, I wrote something in my memoir, Crazy for God, about a school nearby here that my grandchildren were going to that happens to be bilingual French English high school. And I just mentioned it that it was a good school. Somebody who was reading my book
Mhm.
wound up touring the school and wants to put her kids in it. And they called me and said, hey, thank you for sending somebody my way. And it was like half a paragraph. But when I met this woman, she had an interesting story. She had been brought up in Oregon, really off the grid, like you, but more.
Okay.
And she said, oh, well, I know who your parents are because her dad went the other way than your dad.
Okay.
She said, when my parents read your mother and dad's book, they became more liberal. And it was the first time I was allowed to ever wear a pair of pants, cut my hair, or meet a boy.
Mhm.
Because your mother wrote in What is a Family that, marriage and relationships are good. And your dad was writing about art. So to her family, they were so closed off that my right
Mhm.
wing Christian fundamentalist family were the liberals to them.
Mhm.
And then she told me stories about her childhood, like you, except while you're going to the basement and hiding so nobody will trick or treat. Frances
Mhm.
Anita Schaeffer are liberating her dad to at least say, well, maybe art isn't so bad. You
Mhm.
can read a book now.
Right.
Anyway, I just throw that out there
Yeah.
because there's so much washing around, which brings me to a question, and then we're getting back to your book. In your current life as
Mhm.
an editor and a husband, and where you are on your own spiritual journey, whatever church you do or don't do,
Mhm.
how many people do you run into who kind of understand your background, or have you changed your social connections to the point where you're not meeting a lot of people who would get the implication of the passage I just read?
That is a good question. Like on the more fundamentalist kind of level.
How many people do you still know who are like that, who are
Um,
in it?
um, I know a
Not
lot of
know
people
of, but actually talk with.
who are still currently like
Yeah,
in.
whatever. Come from that background and get
Yeah.
who you are.
I know a lot of people who, especially like childhood friends, who were in that world and are no longer in that world. So I feel like there's a lot of people like that, who have, deconstructed or had shifting thoughts on various things,
Yeah.
and largely what's interesting is like their parents have sort of dug their heels in a lot of
Hmm.
ways,
Hmm.
especially over the last 8 years. I wonder what happened 8 years ago. You know,
Yeah.
and so that's just has been interesting to sort of observe
Yeah.
from. I was going to say from the outside, but not really from the outside. Just observe it. So.
Yeah, and is it something you run away from as in, hey, I'm an editor now, I'm writing, I've worked on a book for 15 years, I got another one in the works, I'm done, been there, done that. Don't ask me any more questions about this. Thank God I don't have to talk to Frank Schaeffer every day because I'm sick of this. And hey, I'm 72 years old. I have three kids and five grandchildren. I do childcare for the three young ones who live across the street. And one thing I don't talk to them about is a lot of my family history because been there, done that. I want them to start their own lives and not this doesn't have to be their life.
Mhm.
But when I meet somebody like you, my first question to you is sort of really in my head. I'm thinking, okay, he's out, he's sort of escaped. I wonder if he took all his skin and organs with him or how damaged he is. What did you leave in there that still haunts you? And I guess I'll ask you that before I go to the next passage.
That's a good question. I think a lot of the things that haunt me are in the book. Um,
Yeah.
Different lines that are sort of inspired by things my parents have said, or so I think, yeah, I think there in these sort of fundamentalist family situations, there's almost always, couldn't quite say maybe always, but almost always like a lack of familial connection,
Yeah.
actually between parents and children, because parents, they're not there to, they're not your friend. They're
No,
they're
no.
there to instruct you, which is there's some truth to that, obviously, but like, so I think maybe that connection, uh,
Mhm.
or maybe or lack of connection are some things that maybe haunt me.
Yeah, I mean, there are passages in your book that let me know you see the world through eyes. I often wonder whose eyes I'm looking at the world through. I sort of own some of my brain, but as I've gotten older, when it comes to uncertainty and admitting certain
Mhm.
ironic inconsistency, rather than trying to solve everything, I'm just saying, okay, that's who I am. I own a little bit of my brain. It actually belongs to me. There's another big chunk that was conditioned, and I have no idea where that line is.
Mm.
So when I read this passage here, Cynthia left soon after, and Ruth resumed her Bible reading. She picked up where she left off in Proverbs 5. Let your fountain be blessed and rejoice in the wife of your youth. Lovely dear, a graceful doe. Yes, Lord Jesus, she thought, as she saw her husband take Cynthia on their bi-weekly nature walk in search of medicinal plants, the hope being that these might be able to save them from the ravages of time and age under which the fall had placed their fragile bodies in subjugation. So when I read a thing like that again, this didn't come out of thin air. How do you know this shit?
Well, just growing up, you sort of absorb it,
That's
Yeah.
it. So I'm going to ask you again,
Well,
how much of that is still your brain? And how much is it like, okay, I can draw, this is good material, I'll use it. That's one side. The other side is I still kind of think that way myself sometimes. Um, so I'll put it this way. I make a very bad atheist because all my instincts are not just Christian, but sort of conservative evangelical still in so many areas. And I wonder if you share any of that.
I mean, it's disentangling sort of your upbringing from how you think and perceive the world as a constant journey. So
Yeah.
there's always going to be, I feel like, something that some way that I react to a situation or see something happen, and I'm like, this is the way I'm thinking of this is because of things that have happened in my past or just
Yeah.
who I am as a person. So I mean, there's obviously going to be some overlap there.
Yeah.
Uh, yeah, but
We're
it's hard.
talking to Austin Ross about his book, Gloria Patri, which has a lot of evangelical overtones in it. He's a homeschooled, survivor of an evangelical childhood, is the way I put it. But here's a weird twist that I'll open the door to, that you might not expect from what I've said so far. As I look at the fact that I live in what's left of Christendom, I'm actually quite grateful. I've been reading a really good book called Dominion, and he's one of the premier British historians who's written a trilogy on Rome. Actually, I think published with Perseus back in the day. And Tom Holland has come to the conclusion that, like goldfish swimming in a bowl that don't know they're breathing in the water and look out through the glass, secular humanists, atheists, the French, anybody who thinks they have escaped Christendom is stupid. Not only that, let's be very grateful we're not Romans anymore, crucifying tens of thousands of slaves, beating our wives, having sex with our child slaves without thinking about it because powerful men are always in charge. So Tom has written this book from a sort of a secular perspective, which is really a note of gratitude to Christianity. And I kind of feel the same. I don't know how old you are. You're younger than me. I'm 72. But as I look back, I think when I was more your age, which is kind of when I wrote Portofino, which was published in 1990, I think I was 30, whatever. I thought, okay, I'm on this kind of journey of liberation away from my background. And now my point of view is be careful what you wish for,
Mm,
because actually I'm very grateful for the fact that I live in the United States and not Saudi Arabia. I'm very grateful that I'm not sitting in Syria today with my grandchildren trying to figure out what to do next and whether this Islamic jihadist who's taken over the country is going to keep his word and still allow Christians to worship, or whether he's going to become like ISIS and kill them. Um, I have a much harder nosed view of the world, not from a conservative or a liberal point of view, but from one of gratitude to what I walked away from my parents with, which I no longer believe is true in a theological sense.
mm,
But I'm still grateful for the gift of Christ saying that the powerless are also loved by God.
mhm,
And I look at the Elon Musks of this world and I say, it's a shame you've never confronted that reality, that all the money and all the power in the world is not what people who are trying to live in this, what's left of Christendom should be following. And I think that's the big mistake Donald Trump has made. So that kind of is a long preamble to get your views on your own journey in terms of how far you want to distance yourself from the inheritance, which, albeit flawed and homeschooling and crazy and stupid at times and so forth. On the other hand, I go out now as an older person and say, yeah, but what would you replace this with? So I forgot that I'm on a podcast here for a minute. In all honesty, we're just talking now, and I'm asking you where your head's at on this, because my own head has kind of changed in that regard.
yeah. So I'm 37, so
Okay.
cusp of middle age, but so I think, yeah, there is a lot to be grateful for, and for a while I was kind of embarrassed about my past and didn't
Yeah.
really want to talk about it a whole lot. Um, but now I'm like, I would not be where I am now unless all of these other things had happened in my past. Um, and I'm very grateful and thankful for where I am right now.
Yeah.
Uh, and so in one sense, I wouldn't change it. In another sense, I'm like, theoretically, it's an interesting concept. Like, would you change the things in your past if you could?
Yeah.
Uh, but I think, yeah, there's a lot to that question of like where we are in America and Christendom and all of this, because I think that fundamentalism and religion kind of in general promises simplicity and certainty.
Yeah.
And that's what people really want. Like they want
Mm.
life to be simple and they want to be sure about
Yeah.
things. And I feel like as I've gotten older, I have learned to embrace the opposite of those things that
Yes.
like complex. And
Yeah.
I'm not sure about a whole lot of things, like I don't know.
Yeah.
And that there's a lot of freedom to that. And that in even within the American structure of life, like I'm working on a novel now that's sort of about the CIA operating overseas,
Mm.
sort of is about how we are we are guilty of many of the same things that we accuse other countries of
Sure.
doing. And
Yeah.
so with Christianity, it's the same thing. Like we are guilty of the things that we accuse other people or other groups of doing.
Yeah.
Um, and so I think realizing that and owning up to it,
Mm.
it's just a part of, I think, maturing, which largely the American church has not really done. So,
No, not at all. And gone in the other direction. Although Tom Holland makes a very interesting point, and that is, of course, the only basis on which the Christian church is judged deficient, say, for endorsing slavery or patriarchy, is by its own standards,
hmm,
which is kind of interesting. So that Voltaire and Rousseau and all these French philosophers, basically who concoct the French Revolution and becomes very secularized and so forth. In the end, the only standard at which they can judge the church as having failed is by the standards of Jesus' teaching and St. Paul's teachings. Because in the end, it's like you can accuse the church of hypocrisy and failing to keep its own rules, but the concept of human rights as we understand it in the United States, the United Nations Declaration, this, as Paul Holland points out, did not come out of thin air. This is part of Christendom. It didn't come out of Islam. It didn't come out of Hinduism. It didn't come out of communist China. And to the extent that people like the Saudi royal family now virtue signal
hmm,
by trying to whitewash what they do to women by having a tennis championship,
hmm,
the dynamic they're playing to, the audience they're playing to, the so-called international community is a handful of Western countries who set the standard that they no longer admit comes from Christendom, but nevertheless didn't come from outer space. This is not concocted out of nothing. So I think it's an interesting point because, hypocrisy is a sort of a nod towards virtue
hmm.
because, what we accuse a Roman Catholic priest of doing when he, say, rapes a child behind the altar. In Rome, that would have been fine. He's a powerful person. This is a weaker person. There's no kind of sexual ideology that would prevent him from doing this, and power is worshipped. The only thing that changed was the idea that we crucified God like a slave, and then remembered his teachings on the least of these. And so when I read your book, I'm looking at it through the eyes of someone who totally shares the journey out of evangelicalism, but not, um, not in the sense of saying, hey, let's just throw the whole thing out. The shore called to her. Beyond lay the true light, the ultimate goodness, the Godhead three in one. She only hoped that on the other side of this great chasm awaited her boy she'd abandoned. In the glorious radiant light of this majesty, her mind freed itself of all shackles. She could remember clearly, precisely. Her mind returned to its fullest function. Everything was of great joy in this new reality. The mental blocks slipped from her mind, and she found herself able to grieve and rejoice in equal measure. Oh, Jesus, she thought, forgive me all my sins, forgive. It was in this way that she slipped into true darkness, but a darkness that comforted. In this way, she passed. Um, that is closer to the end of the book. Again, place where we are in the story, tell us what that's about. And just let me say that I think that is a beautiful piece of lyrical writing. I mean, I read that just in awe of your chops as a writer. I look forward to your next novel. Um, it's a beautiful passage and so So beautiful, so well read. I read it two or three times afterward. I read it and I was thinking, oh yeah, the kind of where does this come from? And then I said, well, wait a minute, wait a minute, wait a minute. Just read this as if it's any other book and not on your turf. And it's lovely. You write so beautifully.
Yeah.
Yeah, I really love that passage. Tell us about it.
So this part of the story is Naomi is the mother of this family, this isolationist family, and um, Andrew and Big Boy, if you remember, they're off on their
Yeah,
own militia group, and Naomi and her daughter, or sorry, yeah, Naomi, no, Ruth, sorry, and her daughter Naomi, are on this cross country road trip to kind of collect the
yeah,
because the husband and the son die on the same day, the father and
yeah.
the son. And so along the way, they sort of get pulled into the orbit of this militia group, and this paranoid militia group thinks that they are, false flag actors, essentially,
Right.
kind of paid by the state to pretend that this shooting with Solomon has happened.
Mhm.
Uh, and they attack them, and this is where Naomi dies, essentially.
Yeah,
And so she's reflecting in that moment on her life, thinking
yeah.
about these things. So.
But I think there's an amazing passage. Let's just talk about the writing for a little bit. I mean, it's always hard to know where something came from, but where were you when you wrote that passage? Like, what's happening with you? Because I just think so many times when you read in a book or you see in a movie somebody's kind of last thoughts and how they reflect on something, it doesn't seem to strike true. But when I read that, I thought, that's pretty much what I would do, even having rejected my faith. That's where I would go back to. I mean, there's something very true about that passage, and I just wanted to talk about it. I mean, where does that come from in you? I mean, how have you been with people when they died? Have you talked to people who, where does this come from? Is this just writerly or is it
It
lived
was
somehow?
largely, it was probably largely, writerly, I guess you would say,
Yeah,
in the sense that I knew what the scene was going to be, and then just sort of logically extrapolating what would I think about in that moment? What would this character think about in that moment?
yeah,
Um, and I think, yeah, reflecting in the face of this immense, sudden, very quick moment of
yeah,
uncertainty as you're dying, you're trying to cling on to something that you at least hope is
yeah,
true, right?
yeah.
Um, and so I wanted to, and I also wanted to, like, um, I didn't want it to feel like I was making fun of fundamentalists
I
or
love that in it, by the way. I love that. I mean, it was so true and so generous too.
yeah, I wanted to be.
Did you read that out loud to Audrey, by the way, when you finished that book for any reason? Did you read that out loud to anybody?
I don't remember if I've read that out loud, actually. Audrey's read the book, obviously, but
Yeah.
I don't remember if I've read that out loud to someone. Yeah.
Yeah, because it's a beautiful passage. I mean, it's fantastic. And having read that passage, what was so interesting is it tied so deeply to Paul Rousseau and what he remembers in Friendly Fire of getting shot.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's very odd because you picked his book up long after you wrote yours, but there's an odd correlation between it because he's not having the same thoughts because he comes from a very different background. But the way he describes his own near-death experiences and his thoughts. I can't remember the actual passages. I've got the book here, but I don't, I can't haul it out and start thumbing through it now. But anyway, there's a sensibility there of when he wrote about his own experience. Of course, you attribute him his authenticity and his memory. I don't think we take our best work seriously enough. It's easy to breeze over if you did it yourself. And I just want to tell you that if you were sending out a writing sample to me as a publisher, which I'm not, and you sent me that, I would read it and reread it and just say, wherever this comes from, there's a wisdom and a gentleness there, which is really incredible. I mean, that's an incredible piece of literature. I don't think I've ever read a better last moment. I mean, I'm going to read this goddamn thing again. The shore called to her. Beyond lay the true light, the ultimate goodness, the Godhead three in one. Um, she only hoped that on the other side of this great chasm awaited her boy she'd abandoned. In the glorious radiant light of His Majesty, her mind freed itself from all shackles. She could remember clearly, precisely. Her mind returned to its fullest function. Everything was of great joy in this new reality. The mental block slipped from her mind, and she found herself able to grieve and rejoice in equal measure. Oh, Jesus, she thought, forgive me all my sins. Forgive. It was in this way that she slipped into true darkness, but a darkness that comforted. In this way she passed. I want to tell you, I think that's the best piece I've ever read in my life about the last moments of someone's life.
Thank you.
Anywhere. All Quiet on the Western Front, I don't care. I just think that's a terrific piece of writing. And it represents your book well, but it just leaps from the page. I just, it's so funny. It speaks to me on so many levels as a writer. I have such admiration for it. But as a human, I hope my own passing would be that gentle,
Hmm.
irrespective of the, Christian reference or not. And I know because I'm Edith and Francis Schaeffer's son, that's what I would have that same calling forth, no matter
Hmm.
what I said intellectually about my own
Hmm.
faith. I don't know if you understand how deep that cuts.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. Yeah, that was one of I remember writing that, and I think it was one of the few passages that I didn't change. Like as I was writing it, I was like,
Yeah.
this is working. I remember feeling that.
Yeah.
Uh,
There was nothing to edit there.
yeah.
Yeah. I mean, this is going to be a big stretch. And, I shouldn't do this, but I've got a crazy feeling that if you have some time to consider and you're not, you know, sitting in Alzheimer's or sent to a Mars colony to perish on the outside when they shove you through the door because you don't keep Elon Musk's rules or whatever. Um, I would hope that your own passing would conjure up the image of that passage because I don't think you could die better than that. I know that's weird.
Well, yeah, I think I remember growing up, there's a quote, it might have been John Calvin. It was like a Christian should think as often as possible on their own death,
Yeah.
which just sounds very morbid. But
Yeah.
I've kind of kept that with me of like, it's not a bad thing to remember like I'm going to die. Like
Yeah.
it's going to happen.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. It's funny as I get older, obviously I'm closer to death than ever because 72 is not terribly old, but it's old enough. Um, and I kind of will wind up here because I want to ask you some things. It's interesting how over your lifetime, different things matter to you more at certain times, but you look back on them as a certain, you know, okay, that was then, and I was striving and I had to struggle and do all this stuff. But, at this point in my life, I mean, yesterday I went up to my son's house because he had a leaky oil tank that has to be replaced and pumped out, and his dog was barking, and he's working from home like you are. So I sat down with his dog to keep him quiet so the men could work and supervise the work for hours. And you would think this was an annoyance. But, John fought in Afghanistan at the beginning of that war as a Marine, and he came back to me safe. And, what matters to me most was that I was able to sit there in his house and be of service to him. Literally, all my prayers were answered. And he's alive and has children. And if you asked me to trade that moment of sitting there keeping his dog quiet so he could work um, with, some moment of career achievement, I can't remember those moments at all. They're not vivid at all, as all. But hugging him at the end of that, when he said, thanks for coming over, um, or seeing my granddaughter when she came down to be with Jeannie yesterday to get out of all the noise and craziness in the house. You know, these things matter to me so much more than any of the striving did. When I was more, not just closer to your age, but at a different stage of life. And
mhm.
so, I feel one of the strengths of your book, Gloria Patri, is that for some reason, because I guess this comes from your background as child of evangelicals and homeschooling, you brought with you a kind of a sensibility into the novel, which you don't ever say anywhere, but that last passage, it's so evident, which kind of places a priority on human experience, relationships, and goodness and virtue. I didn't feel that you were cynical at all. Maybe I read your novel differently, but I feel that you presented an image of life which fits in with what is most important about our experiences. And it's often not what we think of at the moment. I know that sounds like a bit of a sermon, but so I'm very curious as to who you are in your own daily life, how you get on with other people, and what you think your priorities are right now at age 37, and how you think that shapes up. Because I think there's a lot of wisdom in your book. I mean,
Mhm.
sometimes good authors are wiser than their life experience only because they've got the ability as a writer to see things clearly for other people, maybe. I'm wondering in your own life if you see things clearly.
Yeah, I mean, I think that rings true to me. That was my goal was to not be cynical as I was writing this. Like I said, I didn't want to make fun of anyone really,
Yeah,
because these people, whoever they are, fundamentalists, whatever, they're holding to these beliefs in a
yeah,
legitimate way,
yeah,
and I think the problem is, ultimately, I think the God they say they worship is really a monster,
yeah,
and they're afraid of God, and they think they have like this little sliver of Christianity. This is the truth, and
yeah,
if you veer from this, you are lost forever.
yeah,
Uh, and so it just sort of it makes me sad in a lot of ways. Of like the human experience is so much bigger than this.
yeah,
Um, and so I think, yeah, I wanted to experience it from the perspective of the people that I was writing about,
yeah,
um, and communicate that to the reader of like these people aren't dumb. They're not dumb
yeah,
people.
yeah,
There are reasons why they think this is true or
yeah,
what. So I think, yeah, as I've gotten older in my daily life, I think being more curious about other people and their
yeah,
experience, and um, that's really kind of maybe the day-to-day driving force as I interact with other people. Maybe is that curiosity.
yeah. Yeah, I think that's really important. Well, we will leave it there, and Ernie, Greg, our producer, will make Gloria Patri a book club offering. Ernie will decide. I think he said April. Um, but I'm going to ask you a favor here. When I sign off, please don't go away because just like Paul gave us your name when we asked him who should we interview, that we may not know. And it doesn't have to be an author or anybody famous or whatever, but just someone that, you've talked to me for an hour and a bit now that I'd be interested in talking to, or who would be interested in talking to me about a book or a project. You're an editor. You must have other authors that you've edited that you think we should know about. Um, Give Ernie a list of names.
Okay.
Stay on the line. You can see
Yeah.
what generation I'm from. Don't hang up on
Yeah.
me.
Yeah. All right.
Stay on the line. Talk to Ernie for a bit and give him some names. Also, give him ways to link to your book or anything else you're doing.
Okay.
If you write something else, let us know. And next time, we won't wait 3 years to interview you.
All right.
We'll be the first. Hey, we've been the first up on 3 books now that made the New York Times bestseller list a couple weeks after. But we were there before the New Yorker or the Times or anybody else. So that's a little
Yeah.
vanity there.
All right.
But anyway, next time, help us get to that person, whether it's an author you edit or yourself.
Okay.
Give Ernie some names. And I just want to thank you for the humanity in your book, the fact that you're dealing with a really tough subject, and there's not a line in the book that I'd say is hateful or looking down on someone. You've written about some very unsavory people with tremendous sympathy. Um, it's a real accomplishment. Um, really, really wonderful book.
Thank you so much. Yeah.
So stick around, talk to Ernie a minute, and I hope I see you again and we interview you again on another book.
Absolutely. Thank you
Give
so much.
Ernie all your contact material too, so we can follow up for the book club and get you back. Make it easy to get in touch with you.
That sounds great.
All right.
Thank
Well,
you.
much love to you and to Audrey, and thank you for your time.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Okay.